I am Mukhwana Isaac with a journey through the Bible. I want to thank you for moving with me from the time we started. And this is episode 9, where we now look at man, the friend of God, disobeying God and losing friendship with Him. But of course, after everything that transpired, hope and promise of victory are given. Chapter 3 of Genesis tells us how suffering and sin came into the world. It tells us of the first sin and the punishment which put man in the condition of needing to be saved. Again, we must remember that the Hebrew writer told many truths as stories in order to help everyone to understand. And so our task is very simple, is to find the religious truth. We now look at the fall of man as as recorded in Genesis 3, right from verse 1 to 6. The temper is drawn as a serpent. In the east, at the time of the Israelites, the peoples around and in the land of Canaan or Canaan had many pagan fertility rites in which the likeness of a serpent was used. There was a continued temptation for the Israelites to leave the one true God and the worship of Him and to join the pagans in their fertility rites around the serpent. And that is why the sacred writer then told the story of the serpent as the temper to show the Hebrews how evil the temper, that is serpent, and therefore their pagan customs was. It had been the cause of man's losing friendship with God. You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. We read this in Genesis chapter 3, verse 4 and 5. The knowledge of good and evil really means the power to decide what is good and bad or evil for oneself, and so to act accordingly. What then does the story of eating the fruit mean? It means that Adam wanted to act independently of God. He wanted to decide for himself what he would or would not do. And so this without thinking of God's intentions. In other words, Adam wanted to act as his own authority, with his own power. He wanted to be his own boss. And in this, he was trying to deny that he was a creature made by God, to whom he ought to give obedience, respect, and a service of gratitude. And so the first sin was a sin of pride, an act of serious disobedience to God. And when we look at this, we see the first sin was rebellion against God's power and authority over man. The rebellion is found now in all sin. Since sin is rebellion against God, the Creator, the Father, it is easy to see why the first sin was so serious. The story of the tree and the fruit must not let us make the mistake of thinking that Adam's sin was not so serious. And after each and everything, we see the result of sin. Some people, there is a lot people have talked about this sin as being a sexual sin and what have you. You see that it was in the middle, and when you, so many things they have put this to be a sexual sin. But I want to tell you, the sin that was which was committed in the garden was the sin of rebellion. That was the first sin, rebellion against God, disobedience. After that, what happens? Result of sin, friendship with God immediately came to an end. You see, God, the writer tells us, drove man out of the Garden of Eden. We read this in chapter 3, verse 23 to about 24. Lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. Chapter 3, verse 22. The possibility of living forever with God was taken away. Still, chapter 3, verse 22. Man would have to die. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. Chapter 3, verse 19. Man lost the gift of integrity. That is the power to have proper reasonable control over the animal passions in him. The eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. Chapter 3, verse 7. The reason why this fact of our first parents feeling concupiscence, you see, you feel that you've sinned, the bodily, that is, here I'm talking about the bodily sexual passion in an uncontrolled way, was written in the Bible, is because the weak control that man has over bodily passion is the clearest example we have of the disorder that the first sin brought into the original order that God made. And so suffering of all kinds and degrees entered the world with the first sin. Instead of simply saying that suffering began, the writer gives a few examples of suffering. 1. Women giving birth in pain. Women being ruled by a woman being ruled by her husband. The difficulty of work for man. Thus man's condition of suffering and unhappiness from the time of the first sin until the end of time have come because of that first sin. There are about two things I want us to note. 1, charity and the gift of reason which God gave us should push us to take away suffering when we can, and so when we cannot, to accept it and unite it with the suffering of Christ. Secondly, it is not important to include work among the consequences of original sin. It is not, because before the fall, God gave man the task of working, that is cultivating and keeping the Garden of Eden. And in doing this work, man would have found pleasure. It is in suffering. Actually, leave working aside. It is the suffering part of work that comes from sin. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread. Chapter 3, verse 19. Thank you for loving this program. That was episode 9. And tomorrow we shall look at episode 10. The promise of salvation, that man has fallen and is confused what comes next. Did God leave man in that state? No, thank you. Subscribe, like, comment, and share. It has been Mukhwana Isaac with a journey through the Bible. Thank you. Be blessed.